Hello, and welcome to The Issue on the ASGCT Podcast Network. I'm host Emily Walsh Martin, and today I'm lucky to be joined by Niki Gallo, Principal Consultant of Regulatory Affairs at Halloran Consulting. Niki has extensive experience shepherding innovative therapeutics through the regulatory process, and I can't wait to share her insights into the complexities of transitioning from the bench to the bedside. Today, we're going to explore pitfalls in timeline management, the nuances of INDs, and the rapidly evolving FDA landscape. So, whether you're from industry or academia, today's timely conversation will help wrap all of our heads around testing novel therapies for the first time in humans. But first, we're somehow already to the middle of March, and that means that the ASGCT annual meeting is almost here. Meet us in New Orleans, May 13th through 17th for the premier event in our field, and save $465 by joining ASGCT and using the incredible discounts the Society provides to members. Check out the full program, plan your trip, and register for the ASGCT annual meeting by visiting annualmeeting.asgct.org. And now on to our conversation. Hello. Today, we're going to be speaking with Niki Gallo, who's the Principal Consultant of Regulatory Affairs at Halloran Consulting. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I am excited to be here, and this is my very first podcast.
Oh, wow. Fantastic. All right. Well, we'll be gentle. I know that today what we're hoping to do is walk through the sort of when, what, and how and why of the regulatory path for gene and cell therapies into the clinic. But before we get to that path, it'd be great to hear about your own career path.
Yeah. Well, I started out in school thinking I was going to find the cure for cancer. So I walked away from the University of New Hampshire with a BS in molecular cellular developmental biology, which is a mouthful in itself. And straight away, I went to Dana-Farber Cancer Research Institute as my first job in the real world. And I was on a bench in what was called a transgenic targeting facility trying to make cloning knockouts for the postdocs on that floor. And I quickly learned, one, that I don't really follow instructions that well, as I'm a better cook, I'm not a baker. So my experiments didn't always turn out perfect. And it was a very sort of siloed, quiet, individual job, just me and my pipette on the bench. And so I wasn't loving that. And at that time, I had no idea regulatory affairs was a thing. So I made a transition from working on the bench, stayed within Dana-Farber, but jumped to the clinical research side, where I was able to be a clinical research coordinator working in the adult heme malignancies team. And that's where I got introduced into what we do, from a clinical development, drug development perspective. And so I got into doing the regulatory filings with the IRBs and maintaining those files, working with the industry sponsors who came in and kind of audited our data entry. And so I did that for a good while. And then I got the itch to jump over to the dark side, the industry side. And so I joined a small sponsor company local to Watertown, Massachusetts. I stayed with them for a long while as well. And I was a regulatory specialist. I was there for about 5 years and really kind of learned the ins and outs from, having a product candidate identified to going all the way up through preparing for a marketing application. And that was with small molecules in the neuro space. So I really got a good appetizer rather for that. And it was there I was introduced to the Halloran Consulting Group. And I was like, that looks awesome. being a consultant, kind of having your hands in multiple pots, learning different things all at once, different products, different indications. And so I joined Halloran, and it's been 10 years that I've been a part of Halloran Consulting Group, always as a regulatory affairs consultant. And it was through Halloran is where I sort of got a taste for cell and gene therapy. And that's one of the areas I really enjoy supporting our clients and getting those products into clinic. It's always an adventure.
Right. And it's funny because you introduced yourself as more of a cook than a baker, and that it almost is like the perfect image, I think, for people who are maybe transitioning from small molecules into cell and gene therapy, right? Because with small molecules, maybe it's a little bit closer to baking when you're taking
Yeah,
something
tried and
into the
true,
clinic.
right?
Yep,
Yeah.
yep. Two species, one rodent, one non-rodent, blah blah blah. But when you move into cell and gene therapy, you get to be a little more creative, and you get to help clients think through the creative way to move into the clinic.
Yeah, and you kind of got to be comfortable being not comfortable, if that makes sense, right? Trying new things, maybe throwing spaghetti at the wall at times to see if it sticks or the agency, can see your rationale and buy into that. So the word's used a lot, but it's true. You really have to be innovative with the cell and gene therapies and, think outside the box.
Absolutely. So I think what we want to sort of delve into is a few key topics, and I guess full disclosure, you and I know each other. We've worked together with various clients, and also I used to be at Halloran once upon a time as well myself, and so I know a lot about what you particularly, but also just the Halloran team brings to the table. And what we talked about, discussing today is really going through the when, what, how, and why of how to move things into the clinic. And we started with when, and I would love for you to tell us, from your perspective. It's this podcast will be coming out in March, which is the perfect timing because groups are starting to get their legs underneath them for December IND filings.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah, yeah.
I would love to hear your perspective on the concept of time as we're moving through delivering a dossier to the FDA.
Yeah, I mean, time is of the essence, of course, but I really see a lot of our clients, peers, underestimate time greatly and at times take it for granted. There's a lot that can happen on a cell and gene product. There's lots of cooks in the kitchen, staying with that theme. There's lots of variables. We're dealing with live products, not a small molecule chemically synthesized product here. So I see our clients make commitments that they probably shouldn't be making it. And I know commitments need to be made from investment, public forward commitments, but I would just try and urge folks to try and keep those as high level as you can and not a specific maybe month or date and time, but maybe, first half, second half of the year type
E-
situation.
exactly. First half is gives well, first half versus second half gives you like full chances for success, right?
Yeah.
Whereas once you start saying February 14th or whatever,
Yeah.
then it's complicated.
And it causes so much stress and it stresses the team out because as folks are moving forward doing their IND enabling work, something could happen at the manufacturing plant, the CDMO. Maybe it didn't meet spec and now we specification. So now you have to do an investigation as to why. Maybe the cell lines came in and it was contaminated. All these various reasons at your non-clinical facility, the whole animal colony is infected, or they can't resource monkeys in, which was a real problem a few years ago. So there's all of these components you need to manage, and that's just one key aspect, right? That's just getting the data, but then you need time to synthesize and digest that data to come up with a well vetted, positioned, and appropriately messaged dossier, which you cannot rush in the cell and gene space.
Yeah, and I think that's a great framing because a lot of times, sponsors will be working with in vivo vendors, for instance, to
Yeah.
help either do their non-GLP or GLP testing of the product in vivo. And with certain vendors, I think you can expect sort of that the work product in terms of a report is going to be easily slide inable to your dossier. But with
Right.
other vendors who may not have interacted with the agency or may be new at this, but have a special model that your project needs, like you can't underestimate the time that it's going to take to help them craft a report that the agency is going to understand.
Right. And it's a collaboration, right? To a certain extent, you as a sponsor want to be reviewing that report and their interpretations and making sure it's consistent with your own interpretation of that data, but realizing, they conducted that study, they are the study sponsor, they have their own internal procedures from a QA and compliance point of view to sign off on said report. So, it can take anywhere from months to 3 months, to get a final report. And you, fingers crossed, you can slide that in. But oftentimes, I haven't seen that happen as frequently as I would like.
Yeah. And so talk to me about those cases. What have you seen clients do if for instance, like sometimes the report you get is just a set of tables, like I did this on this date and here are the tables of data. And so what have you seen clients do in those cases where the vendor's not giving you the sort of robustness of a report? How do you help clients navigate that?
So we try and enable them with tools. We say we provide them with maybe some templates of what a non-clinical report that is submitted for a regulatory filing should look like. And we lean in as best we can. Maybe we attend calls with them and their non-clinical vendor to kind of walk through the expectations for, a non-clinical report. And oftentimes that helps, and we get a product in the end that we can leverage and, put in places of the IND dossier, because it's a lot of copy and pasting. We'll cover that later, but you leverage things from the source non-clinical reports. In other cases, sometimes there's a workaround where maybe they just are not skilled or don't have the resourcing or staff to write a report. And so we advise on sort of doing a supplement report or a report that can be attached to the data. But clearly, be transparent with the agency on who did what and that these are, clients' interpretations of the data and not said the vendor who carried out the experiment.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And just now that we're sort of diving into more specifically the what of the process, let's tie it a little bit back to time because sometimes the early research data, right, is also super crucial for these
Right.
INDs. And so, how do you help teams even sort of manage when to start writing those reports for their internal research data? All those
Yeah.
steps that happened way before you nominated a development candidate.
I mean, ideally, people are writing reports as the experiment is winding down or completing, right? Because we all know if you leave something and go back to it later, it's not fresh in your mind. You may be thinking about it differently. The details maybe aren't going to be there. So ideally, it should be happening in concert, right? Time and time again, we get pulled into client engagements. Maybe they're going for a pre IND. We're not even at the IND yet, right? We're going for a pre IND meeting. And they're telling us, all these great taglines about their product, what it does, the mechanism of action, maybe half-life or, binding affinity. And we're like, okay, great. We'll summarize this, give it a nice story in the pre-IND meeting package. Where's your report so we can leverage what was done? And they're like, oh, we don't have any reports. It's just
Yeah.
PowerPoint slides.
Yeah.
So to try and get ahead of that, I mean, you really should be writing your reports as you're doing the experiments.
Yeah, and I get it. The teams that I've seen, and I'm sure the teams that you've seen, oftentimes the researchers who are doing those first studies, like when they finish one study, they're on to the next study, and it's really
Yeah.
hard to sort of take a breath, right, and do the
Yes.
writing. But the teams that I've seen work the most efficiently, like at least get one report done, because then you can at least start the process of socializing it with your regulatory expert, socializing it with other team members, and making sure that the way you write and frame things is consistent with what your company wants to put forward in these kinds of reports, right?
Right. And I think another kind of fault, maybe for lack of a better word, is those scientists maybe aren't operating with the big picture in mind that this is going to support, a future regulatory submission. So we need to do this with the right rigor, our, documentation practices, et cetera. And to your point, they are just going from experiment to experiment because in their mind, they haven't even identified the drug candidate yet. So this all may be for nothing. So I get, it's a balance, but it will save you a major migraine later if you start writing reports to some extent when you're doing those early proof of concept studies.
Yeah, especially if you're down to a good rule of thumb is if you're down to five possible candidates or something like that, start writing up the screen, right? Because then at least you socialize that with your other team members, come up with the voice of the writing that you want to use, so that as the data comes in and you're starting to narrow further, those next reports are even easier to write.
Yeah, even if it's just the key messages or key takeaways from that report. So you've got it written down while, everything, the data readout from that study is, still fresh because inevitably as you move forward, further down the development line towards, IND enablement, you're going to be pulled in many different directions. And this also comes back to our time concept is being able to put focus where it needs to be because oftentimes these our clients, especially they're small. There's maybe a very small team, maybe two or three scientists doing everything. So getting organized up front and then appreciating likely the time you have is the most important because it's gonna fly by.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's even just little things, right? Establishing just the naming convention
Yeah.
for like start there. Come up with a naming convention that you've socialized with regulatory, you've socialized with the other team members, and you can live with as you move
Yeah.
forward. Because there is nothing more terrifying than in the final 30 minutes before you file having to do a find and replace to
Yeah.
change your terminology.
Yeah, and it happens more frequently than not. Oh, we're changing the product name from ABC 101 to ABC 001. And you're like, oh no, here we go.
Right, right. Because
It
well, and
happens.
let's talk about why those things are important. Why maybe let's talk about this from the FDA's point of view. They receive a dossier, maybe it's for pre-IND, maybe it's for the IND itself, right? Like how do they experience it in your experience?
How do like the reviewers experience
Yeah.
the dossier? I mean, times are changing at the agency as we're witnessing day by day here. But I will say that especially within CBER, which is where our gene and cell therapies are submitted, that they look over these dossiers with a fine-tooth comb. They are reading line by line sometimes and picking up on typos, errors, inconsistencies. You said this in this section, but this section says something different. For IND applications, you actually submit your non-clinical reports that we were just writing about. And so, especially, the non-clinical reviewers, I anticipate that they start reading the summaries that we write that reside within module 2. And that sort of then drives them to dig deeper, where they actually look at the non-clinical reports to see if what you're summarizing in module 2 has the documentation and data to support that. And they go deep. They've gone into non-clinical report appendices, and I've seen them call out, oh, I think you labeled this graph incorrectly. This doesn't look appropriate. So they're taking the time to go through with a fine-tooth comb. Some may hope that they are looking at the bigger picture, the higher messaging, and not being so hung up in the details with your X and Y axes. But some of the things that I find that they're pointing out are indeed critical, and we were moving too fast, and it could change the messaging or, the key takeaway from that non-clinical study.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's interesting how you talk about it. So the reviewers, just so everyone's aware of how these dossiers are structured, right? There are summary sections, and then you go into a little more detailed section, and then you have sort of the primary reports. And typically, that's the way the reviewers encounter them. But the client, the sponsor, is putting it together in the reverse orientation in a perfect world.
In a perfect
not
world,
always.
Yeah, I hope the reviewers do more of a top-down review approach, right? Where they start with the high-level summaries, and then they kind of see our positioning and messaging. And there are graphs and data in those summaries. It's not just words. But then they see that and they're like, I wonder a little bit more about that. And then that's what triggers them to go look at the non-clinical reports. But we as the sponsors, or us supporting our clients, we approach writing those IND applications from the bottom up. So we need to start with what I call the source documentation, the non-clinical reports, the manufacturing reports and data, right? Because you need to write a quality section about how you manufacture your product. You need all of that to write a summary. And it's a bottoms up. So it's different in how the reviewers approach it versus how the sponsors approach it. It's complete opposite.
Right. And the key thing, just you mentioned it in passing there, is that those summaries often contain, graphs, figures, tables that are pulled directly from a, primary report, like the individual study report. And so if as you're assembling that with your client, going from the bottom up, you realize there were errors in those initial reports.
Yeah.
The level of find and replace and QC that has to happen to make everyone feel confident that the data is now correct and reflects reality. It's shocking how much work that goes into that, right?
Right. And that goes back to the time, right? And making sure that we're allocating the time for a fresh set of eyes to kind of do that QA, QC review. And you don't want to start that until you feel you've got your documents near final, right? What's the sense in QCing a document that's still under draft mode? So again, that's that time issue, and inevitably it becomes a fire drill. I have yet to be in an IND application in my almost 20 years that has not been a fire drill. So we try our best to avoid that, but it always seems to happen.
Right. Well, and I would say I agree with you. I've never had a non-fire drill. The ones though, there've been a few where it was like, we know we have these two final pieces that we know can't arrive until the very last minute. So let's have everything else. Let's assume those are going to fit nicely, that the story is going to be still coherent when we get that data. but let's fill everything else in and just wait for those two so that the fire drill is at least a narrow fire
Contained
drill,
fire. Yeah.
contained fire. And so how have you seen teams in your experience try and do that? Like what's involved with setting themselves up for success such that that last piece of data can just slide in at the last minute?
Yeah, I mean, to no surprise, it's having a really strong regulatory project manager managing all of the moving pieces and understanding where that last minute data is going to touch the dossier, because it's likely not touching just one section. It's touching many sections, right? So say, it's always the tox reports that come in late breaking, right? And so the idea is along the way, as we were talking about earlier, our clients, the sponsors are reviewing those reports as they're being generated, right? They're seeing draft one, draft two. They know what the summary or the results are and the messaging from the vendor. So ideally, we're kind of taking those draft summaries at risk potentially and inserting them into the dossier, but with highlights and comments saying, not final content, waiting for a report. So everybody understands this may change. And the hope is that once we're issued that final, either a final audited draft or a final audited report, that it didn't change and we can push everything forward as we thought. But there are instances where there are some slight tweaks, or maybe they uncovered some errors when they do their own QA review of the report. And it's through the project manager as well as the sponsor SMEs in that area having a good understanding of where else in the dossier, the IND dossier, they need to go make updates. So, tox impacts not only the reports, the non-clinical reports, but the summaries within module 2, the non-clinical summaries. It impacts the investigator's brochure. It could likely impact the clinical protocol and the informed consent if there are new risks or safety signals identified. So it's very much communication is key, and having the project manager map out all of the potential documents that are impacted in weekly meetings. Communication is key. That's all I can say. And that's how we successfully mitigated that, because it happens. But we've all seen
Yeah.
the plan. We know what's going to happen. All right, these 3 documents we're holding, they're not ready for publishing. We're on the same page.
Yeah. No, yeah, that takes me back.
Yeah.
For sure. Well, and the other, part of it, certainly, notoriously tox reports are often the final thing. The other sort of final data that can sometimes show up late, right, is the GMP release testing of the GMP batch that needs to accompany the dossier, and that one can also throw teams for surprises, right? If for instance the GMP material somehow looks substantively different than the material used in the tox study or the material used in the efficacy studies, right? To set your nominal efficacious dose.
Yeah, that could be a serious wrinkle, right? Because you may want to just pause everything so you can understand how comparable or not it is to what was used in your non-clinical studies, because that could set you up for some major pitfalls if you just move forward with your IND and clinical study, right? Because you're basing everything off of a different product than what you just produced for your clinical trial.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, especially, and you sort of hinted at this too, there are always pressures on, small companies to have the Christmas IND or whatever it is.
Oh, I hate the Christmas IND, but yes, it happens too
Well,
many
and
times.
and my impression is the FDA doesn't appreciate it very much either. They
No,
would much rather that IND show up on January 2nd,
yes,
where they don't feel they don't lose days, right, from
right.
their own vacations against the clock for reviewing that IND.
That's right. I mean, this is Niki Gallo's rule of thumb is, I would always recommend that you submit in early December, right? And once you're getting to around the December 15th mark, I don't think it's a great look to go ahead and submit a huge IND dossier to CBER, knowing that they do shut down for a few days, so they do lose the days, but they're also taking their own PTO, family time, holiday time. So I try and push clients either to be before the 15th, but if that's not possible, as we know, due to late breaking data, and you still got to get it in at the end of the year in December, then do it after the Christmas holiday, like, the
Yeah.
28th, 29th, 30th realm, so that the agency, maybe they're only losing those 1 or 2 days, New Year's Day or New Year's Eve. Do you know what? So they're not feeling the pinch as much, is my rule of thumb.
I love that. Because again, I think sometimes companies can get super focused on dates, and it's important to sort of, if you've named a date, to achieve the date, right? But finding ways to be a true partner with the agency. And one of those we've already talked about, which is go through your own dossier with a fine tooth comb, because they're going to, and make it easy for them to do that in the way that you structure and write it. But then on top of it, don't throw them something on a deadline in the middle of their holiday vacation.
Yeah, I mean, because the other perspective is the FDA is with you for the long haul of your product development. So you want to have a good relationship with the agency, so
Right.
being considerate of their time and bandwidth and resourcing, um, is something that should be factored into your equation for your timelines for sure. Because they have the ultimate say on whether or not they approve your product.
Yeah. And I think it's fair to say that right now, there's a lot going on for the FDA, and there's probably a lot of anxiety. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's lots of anxiety, with the way the world is, the way our new administration, for example, I've been seeing a lot, all of the DEI initiatives, they have been pulled from the agency's website. They are no longer available. And so, an example, and I'm bringing this up, is I was actively working through with a client on whether or not they need to develop a diversity action plan for their program. And so, I realized last week that they pulled that guidance. It's not even available anymore. And
Mm.
so, it's making us think, well, what do you do? What do we do with that initiative? Because many people still want to do the right thing, and they're going to design their trials with DEI initiatives intact, but maybe we're just not submitting that diversity action plan as, an application anymore to the agency. So I think there are a lot of things, people are anxious about that, about their communication outwards to us, or what they're allowed to say, or the timing they're allowed to say it. It needs review from administration, grant funding from, some of like the NIH or others. It was paused, it's unpaused. So there's just lots of questions, I think, about, how we're going to continue to work with the agency as we embark on 2025.
Plus, just at CBER, there's been a number of, more senior people who'd been there for a while who've, decided it's time for them to retire, and
Yeah.
so they've got a new workforce that they're
Yes.
also bringing up to speed into science, which we talked about at the beginning, which is much more like, cooking the baking, right? So if a
Right.
new person is transitioning from cedar to CBER, like it is a new skill set and a new way of thinking that they probably have to align to.
Yeah. I mean, folks are, retiring, or folks are simply resigning. There's a push to have them go back to the office. And with all the hiring they did during the COVID years, I've read that the campus can't accommodate the workforce. There's that piece. But to the point you just made about, the retiring or folks resigning or moving on to new positions, I think it's bringing in a newer review team, review force, right? Those more senior officials are departing and they're not able to impart their wisdom and ways of working with industry on how to review things in a manner that we would like, just due to, again, time. There's not enough of it, or they're pulled in so many directions. So I think what's happening is we're getting a lot of potentially bakers in as reviewers instead of cooks who can, kind of think bigger picture or throw a dash of this and that and understand, whereas they're more maybe by the book or check each box to
Right.
make sure everything is there. And so that then is going to impact us as sponsors and Halloran with our clients, because now the impetus is going to be on us to make sure our applications are top notch, are organized, contain all of the data that they would expect to be in there, but is written in a way for maybe a newer reviewer, somebody fresh out of,
Right.
postdoc to come in and review your application. So I think,
And especially where like a sponsor is maybe deviating just a little bit from
yeah,
a strict from a guidance, like being able. I think there was a period of time where it was maybe the heyday, and these CBER reviewers were used to seeing the creativity, and so you didn't have to sort of walk them through from the point of view of here's the guidance, here's why we couldn't do the guidance, and here's what we did do that we think is satisfactory, and here's why, and here's the data. Like that structure is something I think we have to like return to now to have the best relationship with CBER, right?
I think so, but I don't think it's an easy thing to return to just with the experience of, I think, the majority of the review team, right? Because they're not,
Right.
I would say that, it's like practice. They haven't done it enough to be able to be comfortable with those sort of deviations from guidance, or they haven't seen enough of these types of products, AAV, for example, to understand, yeah, this is likely okay, or it's going to be tolerated. So it's a learning process. And I think this just puts the sponsors to take the time to make sure they're educating the agency as appropriate on their product so they understand the ins and outs and take advantage of meeting with the agency. That's a must. Any regulatory person would tell you to go meet with the agency before you submit an IND.
Absolutely. And so there's a couple of like tailor-made meetings that can happen before an IND. One's the interact, and one's the pre-IND meeting. What's your recommendations for best practices there?
I mean, definitely taking advantage of a pre-IND meeting is a must. You totally should take advantage of that. It de-risks IND enabling activities that you could be spending potentially millions of dollars on, and then it sets you up to start a relationship with the agency, and they can see what your future IND application is going to include. And so it may make it an easier review when you submit your IND application because they've seen what you've put in front of them at the pre-IND. So that's just a must meeting in my opinion. And you touch on all areas: CMC, non-clinical, and clinical. Whereas, in an interact meeting, that's a little different. They're a little harder to come by. They're not a guarantee. So you sort of have to be in a sweet spot to be awarded an interact meeting. You have to have a development candidate nominated, and you need to have some data available, some proof of concept data available, or some manufacturing data available, but yet you can't be into IND enabling activities or asking questions about IND enabling tox studies, for example. So it's more geared towards really innovative products, and you're not sure how to approach those IND enabling activities. That's really the main, in my opinion, goal of an interact meeting. And if you request an interact and they say, nope, you're too far along, then you just pivot and have a pre-IND meeting. So they're really useful. You need to take advantage of those for sure.
Absolutely. And then have you seen folks taking advantage of the sort of new type D meeting and what's, how do people get the best use of that kind of meeting?
Yeah, I would say I've seen the folks take advantage of the type D as in dog meeting more on the C dir side than the C burr side. But that doesn't mean you can't try on a cell and gene therapy. And again, the type D meetings are a smaller scope meeting focused on one or two sort of key disciplines. And the type D meetings that have been successful kind of center around quick and easy questions, species selection, for example, maybe the need to do in vivo studies for your type of cell and gene product. Like those very kind of focused conversations increase your chances of having a type D. And then that doesn't disqualify you from an interact or a pre-IND meeting either. So there is multiple opportunities to engage before submitting your IND.
Yeah. And do you have like other recommendations for, particularly, the scientists who've never done this before, it's their first IND, like what do you recommend to them as the excitement builds that maybe that's the way the project's moving?
That they got to start mapping out their documentation plans and start as the scientists with the clinical development folks synergizing on what the key messages are for their application. Like, what are we trying to say our product does? Or if there are certain signals that you're seeing, safety signals, how do we message around that to position the risk benefit profile? Mechanism of action is another big one. How are we going to describe the proposed mechanism of action? So, starting those conversations early and then getting your source documentation in order is essential.
I love that. And I think the other thing sort of embedded in what you just said is it is very easy when you're in a company, you're in a functional discipline, right? And it's sometimes easy to just sort of stay focused on what your function has to bring to the table, and sort of maybe distance yourself from the other functions like if you're research,
Yeah.
manufacturing, and clinical. But in your experience, how cross-functional are the best functioning teams that you've been able to work on?
But cross-functionally, they are having a touch point at least once a week where all functions are coming to the table and giving key updates. Are they on track with writing sections, reviewing sections, or is data coming in as expected? Because everything is linked, as you know, Emily, like that everything is connected in the IND. You say the same sentence 20 times in various different places throughout the IND application. So at least weekly, a cross-functional development team should be coming together. And then there's likely sub-team meetings going on where regulatory is participating because, they're kind of the masters of ceremony and are making sure everything is coming together appropriately.
Absolutely. No, I think that's exactly right. It's one of those things where with gene and cell therapy, because, the product is the process and the
Yeah.
product that you used in your early studies, compared to your later studies, compared to the clinic, all these things have to make sense at the end of the day. There has to be a unifying theory of the stuff that I tested for efficacy gave me this answer, and it's very, very similar, if not identical to what I used in the tox study, and that's very, very similar, if not identical to what I'm going to use in the clinic. And so that means, right, that like someone in research has to be infinitely curious about how do we know the material is similar, and same with someone in clinical, like we have to
Yeah.
be curious about all the other disciplines.
Yeah. I mean, and we've been focusing a lot on the non-clinical piece, but towards the end, CMC, the manufacturing product is the process. They need to be pretty synced up with clinical because now the clinical team needs to be able to describe and generate, a pharmacy manual or a handling manual on how to go ahead and administer this product and what the
Right.
process is. And it all needs to be connected, and the data needs to support that.
Right. Like there, at some point there has to be a handling study to say, okay,
Yeah,
when you thaw this vial, you can thaw it at this temperature and for how long it can sit at temperature Y. And then when you move it into a syringe or what have you, we know that like that's not going to change anything about the dose. Like there's an infinite number of cross-functional deliverables that the
great.
teams have to pull together.
Yeah. It's definitely a team effort for sure. There's no I in this team, or else, it would fall apart.
Exactly. Exactly. All right, we're at the end of our time, and so I get to ask my favorite final question, which is if you could wave a magic wand and fix one thing for cell and gene therapy, what would it be?
I would say it would be cross collaboration amongst the industry, our sponsors, our companies out there working hard to develop these innovative products. I think I've witnessed at times, being in a consulting role, I see a lot of different approaches, different rationales that are accepted at the agency and those that are not. So I'm in a unique position where I can see things, but the individual companies aren't. And we all share the common goal of wanting to impact the patients' lives, to address the unmet medical needs. And if there was a way that we could come up with a way of sharing what we've learned, at a high level, that is appropriate in legal terms, confidentiality terms, but just share, the FDA for lipid nanoparticles, they're really focused on the biodistribution because they saw this happen and not disclose any specifics, but then others working on LNP delivered products can consider that in their plans and be proactive instead of being reactive to the agency's feedback. So we could all kind of come up with some type of consortium or group or sharing network where we can help each other be more efficient in developing these innovative products. That's what I would have my magic wand do.
I love that vision. I love it. Absolutely. Well, Niki Gallo, thank you so much for joining us today. I think we've given the audience a lot to think about, especially timely since people may be revving up the engines for hopefully a December 15th IND.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. My pleasure. This was so much fun. And now I can officially say I've done a podcast.
Absolutely.